I pulled that bundle out of the root cellar last October, cloth wrapped, same as it went in 14 months before. Cut through the fat seal with my knife. The smell hit me first. Cured, clean, exactly right. No refrigerator, no electricity, no label telling me whether to trust it. I knew because I understood what I was looking at. Most people today would have thrown that same piece out 4 days after they bought it at the store. By the end of this countdown, you'll understand every step that makes meat last 5 years in the wilderness. Stay for number 5. It's the step nearly everyone skips. And number 2, where getting it wrong doesn't just ruin the batch. If this kind of knowledge matters to you, subscribe. Let's start. Number 10, choosing the right cut. Walk into any butcher shop today and you'll hear the same advice. Marbling is quality. The more fat threaded through the muscle, the better the meat. For a steakhouse, that's true. For long-term preservation, it's exactly backwards. And following that logic has ruined more batches of survival beef than any other single mistake I've seen. Intramuscular fat, the fat woven into the muscle fiber itself, doesn't behave like meat during the drying process. It oxidizes. At room temperature, over time, that fat goes rancid, and when it does, it takes the entire piece with it. You can salt it perfectly, dry it in ideal conditions, seal it in the best container you found, and the batch will still turn on you within weeks because the fat inside the muscle never stopped breaking down. I've watched good people ruin entire batches this way. They started with ribeye or strip steak because that's what they thought of as quality beef, and by month 2, they were opening containers that smelled like old candle wax and something worse underneath. The cuts you want are the ones most people overlook. Eye of round, bottom round, flank, venison hindquarter, elk shoulder. Lean, dense working muscles with very little internal fat. The cheap cuts are exactly right here because they are mostly protein and fiber, and those dry evenly and stay stable. When I trim meat for preservation, tenderness does not matter. Under good light, I run the knife along every visible white streak and pull it away. If I can see fat, I remove it. I save the outer fat and render it separately for the seal at number 5. Any white left inside the meat is a timer counting down toward rancidity. The decision about which cut you use is made before the fire is lit, before the salt is opened. Get it wrong at this step, and none of what follows can save you. Number 9, slicing thickness and grain direction. People assume thinner is always better. Less meat should mean faster drying, but thickness is only half the problem. The other variable is grain direction, and ignoring it gives you strips that crumble or stay damp inside while looking finished outside. Grain direction. Every cut has visible fibers running in one direction. For preservation, slice with the grain, parallel to those fibers. That gives you long strands running through each strip, helping moisture escape more evenly while keeping the dried meat strong enough to hold together. When I first learned this, I didn't fully understand it. I'd watched it done correctly, but one time I was in a hurry and sliced a batch against the grain because it was faster to work that way. The strips fell apart after drying, crumbled when you bent them. More importantly, the drying was uneven. Some sections were brittle and over-dried while others still had give, which meant moisture was still in there somewhere. Thickness should run around a 1/4 inch, not quite the width of your thumbnail. Thin enough that heat and airflow can reach the center in a reasonable time, but not so thin that the strip case hardens on the outside before the inside releases its moisture. A case-hardened surface is the enemy. It looks done while hiding wet fiber underneath, and wet fiber is where spoilage begins. I hold every strip to the light before hanging it. Thick ends get trimmed or set aside. Uneven strips dry unevenly, and if one piece cannot be trusted, the batch cannot be trusted as a whole. The knife work at this stage isn't cooking, it's engineering. You're building a structure that needs to dry uniformly and hold together for years. Now, you've got the right cut and the right slice. What you do to that surface before any heat touches it is what separates a batch that lasts 3 weeks from one that lasts 5 years. These first steps look simple, but they carry generations of trial and failure. Old-timers had no laboratory and no moisture meter. They watched what spoiled, changed one thing, and remembered the result. Use this cut, slice it this way, with science translated into plain language. Choose lean meat and cut with the grain, and you are following conclusions earned over lifetimes. Number 8. The salt layer. Salt looks like seasoning. Here it is, the first active layer of preservation. Treat it like flavoring, and you will use it wrong. Its job is to pull moisture from the surface and make that surface hostile to bacterial growth. Salt draws moisture out of the meat's surface through osmosis. That's the simple physics of it. Salt is more concentrated than the water inside the meat cells, so the water migrates outward. What you're left with on the surface is an environment that most bacteria can't survive in. Too salty, too dry, too inhospitable. This is curing, one of the oldest food preservation methods that exists, predating refrigeration by thousands of years. The ratio and the time both matter. Too little salt and you haven't created sufficient osmotic pressure to pull meaningful moisture or inhibit bacterial growth. Too much, and you form a hard crust that prevents further drying later. You want coarse salt, non-iodized if you can manage it. Iodized salt has additives that can interfere with certain natural microbial processes on the meat's surface, including ones that contribute to the stability of a properly cured piece. Press the salt into every side of every strip, then leave the meat on a clean rack in a cool, dry place. Over the next several hours, the bright, wet red should deepen toward burgundy as moisture rises. When the surface turns matte and darker, brush away the excess before moving to heat. I learned the amount from someone who learned it from her grandmother, enough that you can see the salt, not so much that you cannot see the meat. It sounds vague until your hands learn it. Salt starts the process. It cannot finish it. Number 7. Heat, smoke, or both. Most people who make jerky today think of the smoker as the primary tool. Smoke is what does the preservation. That's the common assumption. And smoke does help. Wood smoke carries phenolic compounds and other natural antimicrobials that deposit on the meat's surface and contribute to long-term stability. But smoke is a secondary benefit. The primary mechanism is heat, applied low and steady, for long enough that both the surface and the interior of each strip drop below the moisture threshold that supports microbial life. Aim for roughly 145 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit through the meat. Too hot, and the outside hardens before the center dries. Too cool, and you create the warm, damp conditions bacteria prefer. In the wilderness, there is no dial. You manage a small maintenance fire with steady coals and little flame. Use clean-burning hardwoods such as oak, hickory, or fruitwood. Resinous pine throws pitch and harsh smoke onto the meat. I built a simple drying structure over a fire pit years ago, essentially a low frame with hanging points for strips, positioned high enough above the coals that the strips never get direct flame, close enough that they feel sustained warmth. Nothing complicated. The structure can be rebuilt anywhere in a few hours from local materials. The sophistication isn't in the equipment, it's in the fire management and your willingness to stay with it. I test the strips by feel. If one bends softly, it is not finished. Properly dried meat resists and snaps when bent sharply instead of tearing. At first, that snap test is your best guide. Tear means more drying. A clean snap means you are close. A commercial dehydrator solves these variables with a dial and a timer. In the field, you solve them with attention, which means you stay closer to the fire than feels necessary and check the strips more often than feels necessary. That's not a criticism of people who use dehydrators. It's just that the attention itself is the skill, and if the machine ever isn't there, you need to have practiced it. Number 6, the airflow factor. Most drying guides focus on salt, heat, and sometimes smoke. Few emphasize airflow, yet moving air often decides whether meat dries evenly or molds on the rack. In still air, moisture leaving the strip collects around it as a humid layer. The surface cannot release water into air already saturated with it, so drying slows and mold may begin before the center is safe. Airflow solves this by continuously removing that moisture-laden air and replacing it with drier air. A steady, gentle breeze across the strips is enough. The difference between a still, humid afternoon and a breezy one can mean the difference between a batch that dries on schedule and one that's soft on day 3 with visible mold forming. I repositioned my drying rack after a batch failed on a still day in late summer. The heat was right, the salt was right, but the air in that spot barely moved even when there was a noticeable breeze 20 yards away. I moved the rack to catch the prevailing afternoon wind and never had that problem again. The strips hang perpendicular to the wind direction, spaced so none of them touch. Every contact point between strips is a dead spot where airflow can't reach, and those spots stay damp longest. In humid climates or during wet seasons, this factor can outweigh everything else. You can't compensate for bad airflow with more heat without overcooking the exterior. The wind doesn't cost anything. You just have to know how to use it. By now, you're managing salt, heat, and airflow. The same problems a dehydrator handles automatically. Modern tools work, but they can hide the reason behind each step. When power fails or equipment breaks, understanding remains. The old method used no machine, only physics, observation, and patience. Number 5. Fat sealing. This is the one. Of everything in this process, this is the step people most often skip, either because no modern guide emphasizes it or because they think the dried meat is finished once it snaps cleanly. It isn't finished. A properly dried strip of beef is stable in the sense that its moisture content is too low to support active bacterial growth. But that surface is still exposed to the atmosphere. Given enough time, days, weeks, months, depending on how the meat is stored, it will slowly reabsorb ambient moisture from the air around it. Oxygen will continue to oxidize the outer surface. The dried protein, which can last months on its own, will gradually degrade. The fat sealing step is what extends that timeline from months to years. Render the fat clean. Beef tallow, lard, or rendered bear fat can work, but every trace of water must be cooked out. Moisture trapped under a hardened seal defeats the method and can support dangerous spoilage. Render slowly, strain clearly, and cool it until liquid, but no longer hot enough to re-cook the meat. Pack the strips tightly and pour liquid fat into every gap. Press them down, add more, and let it settle. Once hardened, the fat blocks atmospheric moisture and greatly reduces oxygen contact. The cured protein inside is now protected for long storage. I opened a crock last winter that I'd sealed the previous autumn. 14 months old, the fat coating on every strip was solid and uncracked. When I broke the fat away and snapped the strip, it resisted exactly the way it should. The smell was right. Not a single piece was lost. The fat itself is food. In conditions where calories matter, that rendered tallow isn't just a preservation tool. It's energy you can eat directly or use for cooking. Nothing in this method is wasted. Number 4, container choice and packing method. People assume a container is a container, but the container is part of the preservation system, and a poor choice can compromise a perfect batch over years. Long-term containers must resist breathing and flexing. Fired clay crocks, sealed tins, and tight wooden boxes lasted because they held their shape. A fitted lid sealed with beeswax or pitch protects the food from air, insects, and rodents. Modern plastic containers breathe, not dramatically, but plastic is slightly permeable to gases and moisture over time, and it flexes with temperature. That flexing, over many cycles of cool and warm, gradually breaks the fat seal at the lid edge. For a batch you plan to use within 6 months, plastic is fine. For a batch stored against a 5-year need, it isn't the right tool. I own crocks older than I am. One estate sale crock still had an unbroken wax seal when I found it. I did not eat what was inside. The lesson was the container itself. It had held its barrier for longer than anyone in the room had been alive. Pack tightly without crushing the fat coating. After the inner fat hardens, press beeswax around the lid joint. Mark the date with a notch, scratch, or tied cloth. Age is part of how you judge the food when the container is finally opened. A container that fails in year 2 is all that work discarded. The container isn't the last step. It's the structure that protects everything that came before it. Number 3, storage conditions. Temperature consistency is something almost no one thinks about when planning long-term food storage. Cold, people think. Keep it cold, and cold helps. Lower temperatures slow the chemical reactions that degrade food over time. But variable cold, storage that swings between freezing and moderate warmth with the seasons, is more destructive to a fat-sealed batch than a consistently moderate temperature. Fat contracts in cold and expands in warmth. A container that freezes in December and warms to 50 degrees in April has gone through that cycle many times before summer arrives. Every cycle flexes the fat seal slightly. Every flex creates a slightly larger stress fracture. By spring, what was an airtight seal in October may have enough cracking to allow air and moisture contact with the meat inside. A root cellar at 50 degrees year-round is a far better environment than outdoor storage that swings 40 degrees between seasons. The root cellar isn't dramatically cold, but it's stable. The fat stays consistent, the container doesn't cycle through expansion and contraction, and the contents are protected from extremes. I once stored a batch in a snowbank during a particularly cold winter, running out of root cellar space and thinking the cold would help. It helped through January. In March, as the snowbank melted unevenly, I lost 3 containers to cracked seals and 1 to a cracked crock. The same batch stored inside would have been fine. Without a root cellar, look for the same stability in nature: a deep north-facing slope, a rock crevice below frost depth, or a buried cache insulated with earth and bark. The goal is not dramatic cold, it is steady temperature. Soil becomes a refrigerator when depth shields it from surface swings. Preserving meat is not one event, it is a system you maintain. The seal must hold, the container must stay sound, and the storage place must remain stable. Earlier households understood food security as conditions managed over time, not a product bought once and forgotten. The last 2 numbers move from technique into judgment. Number 2 is the one that matters most when you're standing in front of an open container, deciding whether to eat what's inside. Number 2, reading spoilage. Modern food has expiration dates, a number on a package that tells you when to trust the contents and when to discard them. That system requires nothing from you. No observation, no knowledge, no skill. You read the number and act. With wilderness-preserved beef, there is no number. There is only what you can observe. The ability to read preserved meat accurately, to know when it's good and when it isn't, is not optional in this method. Lacking it means every time you open a container, you're guessing rather than judging. Here's what good preserved beef looks like. The fat seal is intact, uncracked, without discoloration underneath. When you break the fat away, the meat beneath is dark brown to nearly black on the exterior. That's oxidized protein surface, which is normal and expected. The smell when you open the container is cured, slightly smoky if smoke was used, mineral and clean. Not sweet, not sour, not sharp in any way that gives you pause. The strip resists pressure and snaps cleanly when bent. The interior, if you cut into it, is darker than fresh meat but uniform in color and dry throughout, with no soft or moist center. Failure looks and smells different. A sour or ammonia-like odor means bacterial activity has been present. A rancid fat smell, sharp, almost chemical, means the fat seal either failed or was improperly rendered and has oxidized through to the meat. Any gray or green discoloration, either on the fat surface or on the meat itself under the fat, is a discard signal without exception. A strip that bends rather than resists, that feels moist rather than firm, that has a soft center when cut, discard it. Any one of these signs alone is sufficient reason to bury the batch and start over. I opened a container once that showed no external sign of failure. Clay intact, wax seal unbroken. When I opened it, the smell told me immediately. Not rotten exactly, but wrong in a way that was unmistakable. I closed it, took it outside, dug a hole, and buried the contents. Never questioned it. The smell gave me a clear signal, and I followed it. There is one exception to the rule that you can detect spoilage by sight and smell. Clostridium botulinum can produce its toxin in anaerobic conditions, including improperly rendered fat seals that trap moisture against the meat surface without any odor or visible sign. This is why every previous step must be executed correctly. If moisture is present in the fat when you seal, if the meat wasn't fully dried before sealing, the conditions for botulinum growth exist regardless of what you can observe. The safety of the method depends on the method being followed correctly from the start. Knowing how to make this keeps you fed. Knowing when to throw it away keeps you alive. Number 1, the master principle. Every step I've described in this countdown, the cut, the slice, the salt, the heat, the airflow, the fat seal, the container, the storage conditions, the spoilage signs, these feel like 10 separate techniques. Learn this one, then that one. Assemble the list and execute it. And you can do it that way and it will work. But there's one idea underneath all of them, and once you see it, the entire method changes from a list you follow into a principle you understand. After that, you can improvise. You can apply it to fish, to game, to eggs, to almost anything that needs to last longer than fresh conditions allow. You are removing water and denying oxygen. Those two actions, applied consistently at every stage. The lean cut contains no intramuscular fat to oxidize internally, denying oxygen a reactive surface. Slicing with the grain gives water a direct path out of the fiber, removing water efficiently. Salt draws surface moisture out, removing water. Heat and airflow remove the bulk of the remaining moisture, removing water. The fat seal prevents the dried surface from reabsorbing atmospheric moisture and blocks oxygen, denying oxygen. The right container maintains that seal, preserving the oxygen barrier. Consistent temperature prevents condensation that would reintroduce water, preventing water return, and reading spoilage confirms whether those conditions held over time. Every step is the same two actions in a different form at a different stage. I didn't learn it that way. I learned a list of rules, the same way you're learning them now, and followed those rules for years before the single principle underneath became visible to me. I remember the moment. I was looking at a piece of fish someone had dried differently than I'd learned, using a method I didn't recognize, and I understood immediately whether it would work. Not because I recognized the technique, but because I could see which of the two actions it was accomplishing, and whether it was doing so well enough. That's the practical value of the principle over the list. The list tells you what to do in the situations it was written for. The principle tells you what to do in every situation, including the ones the list never anticipated. That cloth-wrapped bundle I pulled from the root cellar last October, that piece of beef existed because someone, long before modern refrigeration, understood what they were doing well enough to do it without a machine, a label, or a store within a day's ride. They understood the principle. The rules they left behind are the encoded form of that understanding, and they still work. This week, try one thing. Render a small batch of tallow and see what it takes. Or take a lean cut and make a single test strip. Just one, using only what you have. You don't need equipment. You need understanding. Tell me below, which step surprised you most? Or tell me what someone in your family once knew how to do that nobody around you knows anymore. Those are the skills that deserve to come back. Knowledge weighs nothing. It doesn't need charging, and the day you actually need it is the day you'll be glad you didn't wait to learn it.